Last time, on Merritt and Karen, the identity of Triangle remained a mystery, as several suspects in Merritt and Karen's disappearance were investigated and dismissed. The Dominion News was sued for malicious prosecution at a cost of $200,000, a loss that eventually forced its managing editor into retirement. 88 days after Merritt and Karen's disappearance, their headless bodies were finally discovered 10 miles south of the city limits, and an unknown person appears in a photograph at the grave site the next morning. On this episode, the man is investigated, Triangle is revealed, and panic sets in at WVU. From Chromatic Media in the heart of Morgantown, West Virginia, this is Merritt and Karen, the WVU Coed murders. We begin this episode the morning after Merritt and Karen's bodies were found.
The next day, Sergeant Mazingo looked at the front page of the Gazette and said, "Who's that?" Because the police hadn't talked to anybody that they knew of, and they're wondering who it is on the scene because, of course, the people who are imposed themselves in an investigation are suspicious for various reasons.
The caption under the photograph called the man an unidentified member of search party. After a little digging, investigators discovered that the man was a WVU forestry student named Scott Allen Coe. We've changed his name here for the podcast. They also found out that he had been claiming to be part of the National Guard.
Now, that wasn't true. Scott was not in the National Guard. He just seemed to be very curious about the whole search, the whole search for the girls and the whole mystery and so on. The more they found out about Coe, the more they wanted to look, and the more they felt, well, he's a viable suspect, primarily because he had imposed himself on the investigation. One of the first things they found out the next day, on the 18th, was that he had a history of sex offenses, which of course made them even more interested in searching. So they found out various other things about him, such as his dog had apparently drug a blanket with bloodstains on it through a 4-H camp where the Mischief Makers, a band he was in, were practicing. He said that the dog had found the blanket on the bodies. Now, that may or may not have been true, but that's the story he told lots of people. He apparently told a lot of stories. One woman, in fact, called him a big fat liar.
Naturally, the police wanted to confirm his whereabouts on the night of Merritt and Karen's disappearance, so they asked him about it and checked up on his story.
Come to find out that his band, the Mischief Makers, had played at the Country Store Opera in Pansy, West Virginia on the weekend of January 17th. Now, the band returned to Morgantown that night, but he didn't come with them. He and his wife stayed at a home of a friend in Petersburg, West Virginia. So they began checking that out, and when they talked to the owner of the home, who Coe said he stayed with, turned out he did, or at least that guy backed up his story. With Coe, as with so many other suspects in the early going especially, police didn't so much rule people out as being, like you see on TV where they say, oh, well, he couldn't have done it. They didn't rule people out. What they basically did was just lose interest and start looking elsewhere. Because they can only afford to do so much. They've only got so many resources. And they say, well, this guy looks possible, but this other guy looks even more likely. And that's what, in fact, started to happen throughout that summer.
As police were looking into Scott Allen Coe, the students of WVU were trying to deal with the shock of such a brutal crime being perpetrated against their own classmates.
The girls that lived in the dorm with them, even though we didn't know them personally, felt affected by it.
This is Nancy Burkhammer. She lived in the dorm room directly above Merritt in Westchester Hall. She spoke to us via online connection.
On the day they found the bodies, I was among people that were called into the office to speak to a state trooper that apparently was investigating the case. I remember going into the office, the director's office, and there were several people and several other women in there. We began telling our stories to the trooper. The trooper asked each one of us to tell our stories about weird incidents that we had reported earlier after the girls disappeared.
Nancy had reported a disturbing experience while hitchhiking some time earlier. She'd described the incident to her RA, but hadn't heard anything about it since, and assumed she never would.
I was hitchhiking at Ogilvy Plaza, where everybody hitchhiked. A white car drove up to pick me up, and a gentleman stood up on the street and opened the door to allow me to get in on the driver's side. I thought it was weird. I glanced in and noticed the passenger's door was wired shut, the handle, and it was a two-door. And I just felt instinctively like I did not want to get in that car.
The other girls who were assembled that day all had stories like this one, though not all about the same man.
It ended up that there were two suspects that were being described. The one that I saw had dark hair, and the other one had blonde hair. And two of the women had experienced the guy with the blonde hair, and the rest of us had experienced the guy with the dark hair. The guy he didn't look like a student. He looked like he was working class. He maybe was medium height. He was small. I think he had like Vaseline type hair, greasy type hair that was combed back. The car was a white car, like I said, and I believe it might have been an Impala because I remember the bumpers in the back were pointed like the Impalas used to be.
It may be interesting to note here that this car fits the description of the car that Merritt and Karen got into when they vanished. Skip, their acquaintance, who had watched the second half of the movie with them, also specifically mentioned in his statement to police the pointed shapes on the back end of a white car. The girls who had seen the man with dark hair were pulled aside and asked to collectively describe his features to a police sketch artist. When they had agreed upon everything, they were thanked for their help and dismissed. To our knowledge, the sketch no longer exists.
When they disappeared, it was automatic that we thought there was foul play. We felt like if it was random, then it could have just as easily been any one of us. Everyone was scared. Everyone was talking about it. We were sort of obsessed about it. People would pray, and it wasn't because we knew them. It was because we identified with them because we were hitchhikers too. And then when they were found, it was horrific, especially after we found out that their heads, that they'd been decapitated. And it felt traumatic, even if you weren't directly involved. It was something you thought about all the time. You thought about it when you were hitchhiking, and I don't know. I personally was paranoid. I was looking for clues that maybe I could bring back to help the authorities.
Compounding the horror of the discovery of Merritt and Karen were the almost inevitable rumors that began to stir. One of them said that Governor Arch Moore had received another letter that said 4 more girls would die before the killer was done. This wasn't true, but young, insensitive undergrads at WVU took advantage of it for fun.
Some of the male students started pranking the female students by calling them and being like, "You're next." And then girls that were at Westchester were no longer allowed to receive packages because there were rumors that there would be body parts in them. So some of the Coeds started carrying butcher knives on them because they were terrified.
We're a little bit light here because there really was a general panic going through these things were not considered at all funny at the time. They really were afraid of receiving body parts in the mail and those kind of things. We can look back and kind of scoff at that, but it was a terrifying time.
Oh, there was also a rumor going around that a man was carrying a master key and could get into any single one of the Westchester dorm rooms at any time. They had to have sessions with the girls one-on-one to kind of calm down the panic. It was pretty intense.
Less than a week after the bodies were discovered, police received a third letter from Triangle.
Gentlemen, I have delayed writing another letter in hopes you would conclude more information by this time concerning the finding of the bodies. The heads can be found from the position of the bodies by striking out 10 degrees southwest for the first head and approximately 10 degrees southeast for the second, roughly 1 mile. You are already 7/10 of that mile. They are within the mine entrance, if you can call it an entrance, considering its condition. They are buried not over 1 foot in depth. The ones responsible for the murder scattered some of the girls' personal effects over the general area, creating a pattern of confusion, making it difficult for you to pinpoint any exact location. My first 2 letters triggered your intensive search. Don't give up now. I will identify myself when your investigation is completed. Sincerely, Triangle.
There was indeed a mine in the area, as we heard from Rod Everly, the National Guardsman whose squad discovered the bodies. Naturally, police couldn't afford to totally ignore Triangle's instructions.
They had a sump pump out there draining a pond because that was the closest they could find to an entrance to the mine. Other than that mine was really old. Most of those you probably couldn't access. They probably would have been cemented over. So when they drained that pond, they found that baby doll head, and that's it.
In the quest by the Dominion News to publish as many stories on the Coeds as possible, a photograph of the baby doll head and the draining pond appeared in the paper the next day. The imagery was just too tempting.
They did go into a couple mine shafts a little ways and found nothing.
By this time, law enforcement had taken an interesting double stance on Triangle and the letters. Privately, Triangle was a primary suspect, but when asked by the press whether the letters had been of significant help in the search for Merritt and Karen's remains, they flatly denied it. The letter, they pointed out, had said the bodies would be 26 miles south of Morgantown. The girls were found closer to 10. This dismissal did not sit well with Triangle, who then wrote a final letter, not to police, but directly to Merritt's parents.
Dear Dr. and Mrs. Malarick, I have sent 3 letters to the Morgantown State Police Detachment concerning your daughter Merritt and Karen. The first and second letters were taken with some seriousness and instituted a search which was successful in locating the 2 bodies, minus the heads, which were needed for other purposes. All of a sudden, the police have been complaining about an error in the mileage as stated in my second letter. After one has driven in an oval pattern for 26 miles under the weather conditions of January and under the involved circumstances, it is possible to make about an 18-mile error in the precise location of the bodies. Nevertheless, they were found south of Morgantown, and don't let the authorities try to convey the idea the letters had nothing to do with finding the bodies. Before receiving them, they really had nothing to go on. They also expected me to jump and immediately identify myself. I did say I would identify myself when the bodies were found, but the police so far have left too many loose ends in their case. The third letter, which they have chosen to do little about, states about as specifically as possible the location of the girls' heads. If you have not seen any of the letters, may I suggest you ask the police to see all three? I am hoping the messy situation is soon brought to a conclusion for all our sakes. Sincerely, Triangle.
It's hard to imagine how difficult it would be for a family who lost their daughter, then learned that she had suffered a terrible death, to read a letter like this. The vague reference to Merritt's head being needed for other purposes, the use of the phrase, "for all our sakes," as if Triangle were somehow suffering along with them in comparable measure. If Triangle wasn't the killer, and he had finally directly claimed not to be, what sort of person was he to write these letters? That's exactly what two separate groups of mental health professionals set out to determine, independently meeting to profile him.
The collected people believed that the letter writer was someone under 30 years old. They were asked if they thought the missing heads, what that indicated, and whether that was a part of a ritual or something. And they sort of collectively, again, thought, one person said, a mentally retarded person's attempt to throw the police off, to prevent identification. It's like, well, if I cut their heads off, I won't be able to identify them, which isn't very smart, so I think that's why they threw the developmentally disabled label on that.
Something we have not yet mentioned about the discovery of Merritt and Karen's bodies that starts to become an issue here. The girls were found fully clothed and wearing the same outfit they had disappeared in.
However, they did not find Merritt's fur-lined boots or Karen's fur coat. They thought it indicated a paraphilia of some kind, which is basically their sexual gratification is focused on an item of clothing. You might have heard it talked about as a fur fetish, or there's a whole bunch of them, but those are called paraphilias collectively. They also thought that the superficial burial was not just a matter of convenience, because it would have taken a lot of time to gather all those things, the rocks and all the debris, but it was also a matter of it would allow the perpetrator to return to the scene of the crime, to revisit the crime occasionally. They said that he probably was not, that he's probably emotionally flat. He wasn't always aggressive. But he had periods of aggressiveness. That he was very good at blocking out his feelings, but then they would come rushing back. When they were asked about the idea if it was a hippie cult or some kind of religious cult, they said, no, that's not likely, because if nothing else, someone would have broke with the cult and would have come forward by now. They also thought that nothing should be printed in the papers that ridiculed the person who wrote the letters or scoffed at him or anything, because they thought that would just set him off and that could result in more bodies. Probably energetic and imaginative. He likes playing games. He's probably not a college graduate, but has a superior attitude and thinks of himself as very clever. He also gives very vague directions, but he might well think that they're specific and clear.
I agree on that.
He has a strong fantasy life. And so one of the police officers said, so you do think that the letter writer was the perpetrator, was the one who killed the Coeds? And they said, yes, definitely.
Much has been made up to this point of police mishandling of this case, and we'll talk a little more about that next episode, but when credit is due, we should give it. As a parade of horrible people all became suspects in the case, State Trooper C.G. West remained focused on Triangle. With nothing more than the name of a city and some handwriting to go on, he began the long, laborious process of comparing thousands of handwriting samples to Triangle's letters. He initially went through driver's licenses and voter registration paperwork, one by one by one.
That's a lot of police work. 3,000 things, analyzing, making notes and saying, it might be this, it might be that. That's a lot of work. It looked like he had taken the letter and tried to copy it himself, because there is a page in here where he marks over it and talks about the loops and the serifs and makes comments down at the bottom. So he not only was searching through all this other stuff, but he also replicated it, not traced it, but tried to get it as close as he could so that he could really analyze that letter.
It wasn't until he started going through other police cases that he finally discovered a pink 3x5 card with matching handwriting. The Puget case.
So you want to know about that case?
The Puget case centered around a violent Pennsylvania man named Stanley Haas Jr., who had already been convicted of rape. After escaping from jail, Stanley slipped away from Pittsburgh police in rush-hour traffic, commencing one of the largest manhunts in Pennsylvania history. He stole a car and a gun, but was soon spotted and followed into a parking lot by patrolman Joseph P. Zanella. Zanella exited his cruiser with his revolver drawn and told Haas to exit the stolen car with his hands raised. According to a witness, Stanley remained facing forward, carefully examined his rearview mirrors, then fired 2 shots over his shoulder, killing Zanella on the spot. Still on the run, he made it out of the state, all the way to a city that should be familiar to listeners by this point, Cumberland, Maryland. Linda Puget, a petite blonde whose husband was away for military service, had just returned to her car in a shopping center parking lot. Stanley stole the car, with Linda still inside.
So when she came up missing, and they kind of assumed it was Stanley because he had already just kidnapped someone else, they thought she'd turn up. But she didn't turn up, and she didn't turn up.
The disappearance was ready-made for media coverage. An escaped rapist, a dead police officer, a missing woman, and the kicker, in the back seat of the stolen car, was Linda Puget's infant daughter, Lori May. After some time had passed, with no sign of the two, the police received a note, written on a pink 3x5 card, detailing where to find the bodies. The high-profile disappearance of 2 people leads to a letter predicting where bodies can be found. Stop me if you've heard this one. The note was not signed with a triangle, but the parallels and handwriting were too striking to be coincidental. It was time for more expert analysis.
So, after Lieutenant C.G. West found that this letter matches the Puget letter, it was sent off to a crime lab in Washington, D.C. It says, I would estimate the anonymous author to be between 20 and 25 years of age, not one below this age group, nor someone above 50. As to the sex, the best estimate is that the writer is a male, outwardly timid and methodical. The indications as to race support the belief that the writing is that of a Caucasian. In studying the text of the letters, one can derive a feeling of anxiety that the bodies be found. This is also great concern that the animals are now on the move, implying a sense of urgency. This does not suggest the mind of a typical criminal who is more anxious that the evidence remain concealed. Instead, it suggests a certain remorse and a sudden desire to be of assistance. It says it is interesting that 78 days elapsed before the first letter on the location of the bodies was mailed. Then, as if suddenly conscience-stricken, the writer mailed 3 letters within about 2 weeks, all designed to speed the discovery of the bodies. The writer promised to identify myself when the bodies are located. It is unlikely, however, this voluntary identification will transpire because it appears from the letters the writer is more concerned with the finding of the bodies so as to obtain the necessary mental relief that prompted the series of letters.
The note card would soon show just how wrong all of the experts had been.
I'm not scared of the devil. He is not within me. He's just a fabrication of your paranoid reality.
What police would eventually discover was that there were actually 3 people involved in the triangle letters.
It's Mr. Fred Channing, Mrs. Annabelle Young, and Dr. Richard Warren Hoover.
Richard Hoover and his mother Annabelle Young presided over what they considered a church, which one news outlet called the Psychiatric Science Church. Others, myself included, might refer to it as a psychic cult. They say that the only difference between a cult and a religion is its number of adherents, and by this measure, it was a cult. We have no way of knowing how many people were involved, but claims about congregation size ranged as high as 24 in one publication. We suspect it was much smaller. In 2007, Reverend Hoover found the same websleuths.com article that Sarah would eventually find, in which Jeff asks for people with knowledge about the case to get in touch with him. In response, Hoover wrote to Jeff about the circumstances surrounding the case.
This is from a letter from Hoover to me from 2007. At the time, I was living in Somerset, PA, 75 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Fred Shanning was a believer in the psychic and spiritualism. He came up to Somerset twice a month for readings, consultations on various matters in his personal life. He invited my mother and me to visit him in LaVale. We did. During our visit, Mr. Shanning said, "I would like a reading." We began the reading concerning money, etc., when all of a sudden, in the middle of the reading, he asked, "What happened to the missing Coeds?" He did not mention Morgantown, West Virginia. I do not remember who the spirit entity was, but instantly the message was, "Their bodies can be found 10 miles south of Morgantown, West Virginia, in the woods off an old logging road."
The church had a theology, its details lost to time, that blended elements of Christianity with 19th century spiritualism. In fact, Hoover said that the triangle that closed the letters represented the Christian Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and yet seances were common practice for the group.
Hoover was a medium for a spirit called Dr. Spencer, who was telling them, this is how you find the girls. And Annabelle was like transcribing it into a letter, writing down the notes. They tape recorded that seance. And they had the recording and they gave it to the police, and the police listened to it and were like, these aren't the guys.
And by the way, Dr. Spencer is a common entity cited by psychics in the last 200 years.
Dr. Spencer is supposed to be from like 1800s London?
Something like that.
Having taken the time to study the case, Sarah and Jeff both seemed to dismiss the idea that Hoover was, in fact, a psychic.
He said from the southernmost tip of Morgantown, which, where the hell is that? I mean, are we going by a road map? Are we going by an atlas? I mean, there's plenty of wooded areas where you end up. Do you go to the left? Do you go to the right? You're on a road. It's really not helpful at all.
Right.
And what's the 25 plus 1? Why not just say 26?
His directions, the letter was an odd mix because his directions sounded very precise, and he even included a drawing that, that looked like it was possibly, and later it was talked about by doctors as if it was a draftsman, as if he was a draftsman or a wannabe draftsman. But the directions really weren't very precise. They were just worded and phrased in such a way as to sound precise, like the southernmost tip of Morgantown. Well, what does that mean? Who knows? Saberton?
Or the nth to the nth degree.
To the nth degree. So he spoke in language that made it sound like he was an educated, thoughtful person.
A learned man.
A learned man.
He also said that after the bodies were found, he would identify himself. Did he ever do that?
No, he never stepped forward, but apparently they came knocking.
I mean, he did want that reward money after they figured out who it was. I mean, according to the papers, they did try to get the reward because they felt that it was their information that led to the bodies and that they were entitled to it.
They never received the reward money. I asked Sarah, what about his correct prediction that the girls would be found under a pile of brush?
I mean, you're in the woods. You can kind of say it's going to be covered by brush, I think. You could say it's going to be by a body of water and by some trees. You can say you can hear birds off in a distance.
And at night you can hear crickets.
Nevertheless, I asked them, is it possible that the letters still contributed to the finding of Merritt and Karen's remains?
Whether or not he had actual information through this psychic Dr. Spencer or not, he definitely gave it the more oomph that it needed to finally find those bodies.
But they had already been searching in that area, and the glasses were found there before the letter was written, and they were already looking in that area. So I think it did spur what they were already doing. It didn't start them searching in that area.
No, but it did have the governor, say, hey, here's helicopters, here's more reservemen. Gave them more manpower.
Regardless of what we think about whether Hoover contributed supernatural help, it was clearly a milestone in his life.
He was following it in the newspaper even after he was involved. Like, he was very interested in it.
Of course, he thought about it, but also he used it in advertising. Didn't he, Sarah?
Yeah, when I was researching old newspaper articles and finding his name, he would be at these flea market places where it's not just someone selling flea market items, they'd also have dentists there. So he set up shop as the resident psychic, and he used it in his adverts that he had helped find some Coeds in West Virginia. He didn't use names, but he said he was instrumental in their findings.
He also says that, I said that psychically, this is quoting from the letter, that it was a cult killing. There was one white man and also a black man involved. As far as I know, it was never looked into. It was a ritual killing and the heads were saved. One of the parents, don't remember which one, was a dentist. That would have been Dr. Malarick. And he threw a reporter out of his office and said that if any returned, he would call the police and have them removed. Also, if any of us attempted to collect the reward, he would have us arrested.
If you'll remember back to our discussions at the site where Merritt and Karen were found, Jeff and Sarah discussed the theory that it would have taken two people to create the girls' makeshift grave.
There was a big branch over top of Merritt and Karen where they were buried, and the police testified, someone from the state police testified that it took 4 people to move that tree. And that's where the idea that it had to be more than one person. But as Gooden and a couple other state police people pointed out, the tree didn't have to be moved. It's as if a tree had forked into 2 different routes, and one of the branches comes up and then turns left, and it's all kinds of crazy shapes. It's not a straight tree at all. It's not just like a pole.
It's very thick, though.
It's very thick. It looks very heavy, but
It looks like a tree just fell over. And I mean, it would be possible that if there were a tree there, then they could shove the girls under there. But, I mean, those rocks that they placed over there, that might be a little difficult for one person to handle, because if the tree is already there, dragging the rocks is probably no big deal, or even rolling them, but to put them on the body under a tree that's already there, that'd be someone pretty strong if it's just one person.
As strange as it may sound, Hoover's letter was not the only time that Jeff has been told by psychics that 2 people were involved.
there's a network of psychics who try to assist in cold cases, and based in Virginia, and they had done a brief summary of the case for us, even though they didn't really know much about the case. And they also strangely said it was a cult killing and a black man and a white man. Now, I have no reason to think that they had communicated with Dr. Hoover, but who knows?
As for Dr. Hoover, he was already middle-aged when Merritt and Karen were abducted, but he's still around. He's now in his 90s in an assisted living facility in the city of Casadaga, Florida. Last known place of employment, the Casadaga Spiritualist Camp. Nickname, Séance City. That's all for episode 3 of Married and Karen. In episode 4, we learn just how violent Appalachia was during the early 1970s, as more than 30 suspects were looked into. We bring you the highlights, including a confession, leading up to episode 5, what everything has been building to. The man tried and convicted for the murders of Married and Karen, but everything is not as it appears. Married and Karen is a passion project of Chromatic Media. All episodes are free and without advertising. The show is now available on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podcast Addict, and Player FM. You can also check our website at chromatic.media, that's KROMATIC.media, for all episodes, photographs, old newspaper clippings, links to the music and musicians, and more. If you enjoyed the show, take 2 seconds to subscribe and rate it on your podcasting service. It makes a difference in helping fellow podcast listeners find good stuff. Married and Karen is produced by myself and Sarah Gibbons, with lots of assistance from Jeff Fuller. Our theme song, which you can hear right now, and other instrumentals throughout the show are written and performed by John Smithers, Nick Larson, and Annie Stroud. Those tracks were produced by Nathan Snyder. All the music you hear in every episode is written and recorded by Morgantown musicians. Up first, we had Haggard Wolf with the intro track to their album Morningside. Our mainstay artist, Ordo Templi Sonica, with the track Etheric Lens. Ghost House with The Devil.
I'm not scared of the devil. He is not within me.
And Bob Shank with Tunisian Radio. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for future episodes.